Now we're going to look at the Mesolithic period in Spanish Levant and Northern Africa. Remember, Mesolithic stands for Middle Stone Age. This is a rock painting from Tassili in the Sahara. Dates from around 4000 BC, so we've moved through many thousands of years already. The Mesolithic period begins to distinguish itself from Paleolithic art in that the images of man become much more common. Now, what are some possible reasons for this? First, there's an evolution toward a more egocentric way of thinking. Man's beginning to see himself as the center of all things, a concept we should certainly be familiar with. Secondly, there's a move away from symbolic toward pictorial art. Pictures in this case are functioning as writing. Now, this image seems more a record compared to the shaman-like images of mankind that we've seen previously. The Mesolithic images are still in out-of-the-way places, and that suggests that these sites were still held sacred. Think about the connection between religion, so to speak, and art. It's very strong. Art and survival. That's a very strong connection in this time period. So we get the sense that art was of critical importance to the cave painters and the cave hunters. What's happened to the role of art in our society today? It's certainly diminished a great deal. Maybe things aren't progressing quite to the point that we think they should be. Now, the frequent thought was that art in the service of religion was perhaps the other way around with the cave painters. This is an animal hunt from that same cave, 4000 BC. We've got very lively figures here engaged in the hunt. Again, very different from the shaman-like images. This is, like the previous piece, more a record than a ceremonial image like we saw in the well scene. These figures look like they could again come right out of the 20th century and certainly share some characteristics with Matisse. Now we're going to look at some Stone Age sculpture. Sculpture left by the hunter artists, a term I love, hunter artists, not something that you typically connect today. Sculpture done by these hunter artists was done in a variety of techniques and in a variety of materials. We'll see some done in stone, some in ivory, some in bone, and some in antler. This is a piece called Bison from Dordogne, France, 15 to 10,000 BC. So exactly the same time period as the Lascaux cave. This is made from reindeer horn and is only 4 inches in length. The incising techniques were used in the bison made of reindeer horn. The incising here was consistent with the techniques used by the painters in some of the wall paintings that we've already looked at. Now, what technique other than incising is used here? I'll give you a hint. It's a very modern form of sculpture. How do the legs appear to have been made? Think about this. Horn, antlers. Okay. The legs were apparently made, and the overall shape of this piece was apparently made from found materials. Found objects. A great form of sculpture today, present way back in the Old Stone Age. Now, was the turned head in this image an original intent on the part of the artist, or was it merely a response to the materials? What was the shape of the material, and how could that best be utilized? Now, this relying on found materials pops up in another artist's work who I think you'll be familiar with. Now, when I go to the next slide, Just take a quick glance at it and see what you think you see. Did that sound funny? Maybe it did. Your first response was probably that this was just a representation of a bull's head. But after you spend a couple seconds looking at this image, you see that Picasso, in the 20th century, fashioned a bull's head out of bicycle parts. We've got the seat of the bicycle forming the head and the handlebars forming the horns. This is a wonderfully inventive piece by Picasso, where he uses one object to call up another. You might look at this and say, well, how is that art? I could do that. I could put these things together. Well, my question to you is, did you see this connection and present it as art? Much of the 20th century involves art, making art that's more about the idea than the actual execution. Picasso was a genius. He was a great technician, but he was a genius because of his ideas and his ability to see things unlike anyone else. Women scorned by Picasso in the early 20th century would make fun of him on the way to the junkyard. Say, there goes Picasso the junk collector. Well, I think you'd like to sell your junk for what he did. These are two bison, a clay relief in a cave in France dating from around 12,000 BC. Now, another technique is evidenced, sculptural technique, by these beautiful bison that are modeled in clay. They're an example of what we call high relief sculpture. Now, high relief sculpture is sculpture that emerges from a background and comes out a great deal, at least half its depth. These bison are in dramatic contrast to the next image. Here we have a relief of wild cattle, also from France. And these wild cattle were executed in low relief, as opposed to the deep relief we previously saw. Low relief is sculpture where it just barely emerges from the background. From the introduction, I gave you the idea that low relief sculpture, a great example of which that you already have, are the coins in your pocket. Here we have one of the most famous images from this entire period, one of the most famous images of a woman from all of art history, in fact. This is called the Venus of Willendorf. Dates from around 25 to 20,000 BC. She's made of limestone, and she's 4 3/8 inches tall, so you're probably looking at her much larger than life. Now, humans in Stone Age sculpture are represented much earlier than they are in paintings. Okay? So they precede the representations of mankind in paintings by a great deal. Now, the Venus of Willendorf is one of the finest examples of humans in sculpture. Now, does it appear that describing a particular woman is the main point here? I don't think so. This image and others like it are about fertility. Now, why do we argue that? Well, one, there's no face. Okay, there's a lack of facial features, so the figure's anonymous. Second, what's exaggerated here? Female attributes that we associate with fertility. So there's this anonymous character and this expressive exaggeration. Now, many of these figures were found in connection with hearths and burials of the Aurignacian period. This figure would have been worshipped, perhaps in a cave, to symbolize the womb from which we come and to which people return to, in a sense, as the earth itself can be seen as a womb. Here is a woman holding a bison horn. from Dordogne, France, 23,000 to 20,000 BC. It's painted limestone and is approximately 18 inches high. Now, not only were animals sculpted in low relief, so too were humans. This woman with the horn is also a fertility image, a shrine in fact. Now, a relief such as this is often originally firmly grounded in pre-existing rock formations, as we suggested earlier with the horse. Every aspect of this sculpture is concentrated on fertility rites. The maternal belly, the position of the figure calling attention to the horn, and this is important because it recalls the African belief that the highest symbol of fertility is that of the horn filled with blood. Now, the figure was highly polished and originally painted red. This is further reference to blood, yet there's no trace of a face on the head. No features, no modeling, no polishing. This again was an image of fertility, not a representation of a particular woman. The figure itself is beautifully modeled. Now, many of the points we make are accepted without question with respect to the purposes of prehistoric art. However, flies in the ointment do exist, as we'll see in the next image. This is called the Brassempoy Lady from Landes, France. Guess a date on this. It's from around 36,000 BC. Now, how does this differ from the Venus of Willendorf? Well, it's very specific. This seems almost to be a portrait, as opposed to the fertility images that we just looked at. The image is difficult to explain. Perhaps that's a major reason why it's not referred to in a number of textbooks. Like great modern art, if it's not easily categorized, it may be ignored. If you'd like to do a report for some extra credit, send me an email with information on the Brassempoy Lady and how you assess its place in art history. Now we're going to look at the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Age. This is distinguished from preceding periods by a shift of interest in art. The chief among these interests was a greater interest in the environment. Art began to fuse with science, a new, or perhaps not so new idea. What have we here? It's Stonehenge. This dates from around 2000 BC. 97 feet in diameter is this great stone circle found in Wiltshire, England. Stonehenge is an example of what we call a megalithic construction. The megalithic culture that produced Stonehenge, megalithic meaning large stones, was created by the people of Europe, and the mightiest of the great stone circles, or hinges, that they created was found in England. Now, it's generally accepted that Stonehenge served as a remarkably accurate prehistoric calendar. The intellectual development of human beings made a great step forward at this time with this monument, and there must have been a highly organized social structure to get the incredible amount of labor done. Now, the giant stones are erected in a circle called a cromlech, and we can probably see that a little better in the next. The stone circle is set within a huge circular mound. Off to the left of the great circle was a stone called the heel stone. Now, astronomers have determined that the sun appeared to rise over this stone at the midsummer solstice when one stood in the center of the circle. It's thought that ancient astronomer priests may even have been able to predict the occurrence of eclipses from the structure of Stonehenge. Now there's a slight deviation in the axis of the Earth with subsequent shifts in alignments of heavenly bodies, and this shift has enabled astronomers to date Stonehenge at first to approximately 1680 to 1650 BC, but recent carbon dating has modified that date to around 2000 BC as the date I gave you earlier. Now the outer circle was constructed of local sarsen stone capped by lintels. At the top of the great sarsens are small protuberances called tenons that were used to secure the upper lintel, and that connected each of the sarsens with its mates. Okay? Basically what we have here is a post and lintel construction. You have two posts and then a lintel on top. That little protuberance from the posts that fit into the lintel again is called a tenon. Now this post and lintel construction is also called a trilithon, or three-stone construction. And this post and lintel construction is even used in modern buildings today, many doorways. Also, post and lintel construction was used in the most famous of all Greek buildings, the Parthenon. The amazing engineering feats here involve the weight of the stones. Now the giant sarsens weighed as much as 45 to 50 tons. The builders probably dug sloping holes for placement, and then they tipped the stones into place. But they came up rivers. They had to do a lot of moving of stones to get things into place here. What they did to put the lintels in place was probably almost construct a hill up beside one of the posts and then push the stones up into place. So Stonehenge is a remarkable construction, a remarkable feat of art and science both.